Welcome to Investors Playbook, a show for the investor done by industry experts. My name is Simeon Papailias, and I am the founder of REC Canada. Myself and my partners have been at this for about 15 years, and we are trying to put together a community, a brand new community, the Investors Playbook community that will live on our website with tons of resources, insights, interviews of the people who create housing in this city, of the people who govern housing in this country, in this province, and naturally, locally right here in Toronto. Today, I am joined by Mr. Sasha Chuchus, the CEO of Greybrook Securities. Sasha has been in the home manufacturing space, in the development space, in the capital raising space for a very long time. And he will be bringing his insight as to some of the market's hottest topics right now, which is home affordability. We have all seen the last 2-3 years, a 30, 40, in some markets, 50% increase over those same couple years. Sasha, welcome to Investors Playbook. It means the world to have you on the show because your insight is extremely sought after by government bodies, by advisory boards, by actually even the Home Affordability Task Force itself. Welcome to the show, brother.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sasha, tell me a little bit about what you've seen these last couple years. I suppose it's a long time to talk about, but it's kind of, the pandemic really accelerated a lot of things. Tell me a little bit about your take on what's brought us to seeing every newspaper every day saying that affordability is out of control, calling to the government for help. What do you see as happening? How can we interpret this in a clean and understandable way to the investor community?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if I could put my finger on one way to describe it, at least from my vantage point, is this Southern Ontario market in particular has some very strong fundamental features, and we'll get into some of them. But the supply-demand dynamic is something that I always point to as something that has always driven housing price sustainability. Okay, so we're not going to talk about the hypergrowth for a second. We're going to talk about the sustainability. I think sometimes what takes us into these hypergrowth situations are unusual circumstances that come together. In this case, the pandemic sort of dropped, interest rates dropped. You had savings rates kind of accelerating, and it was almost like a perfect storm because the prior couple of years, housing velocity had actually cooled off a little bit.
Sure.
So we were sort of doing a little bit of borrowing demand from the past, or demand that would have been there in the past and people were maybe sitting on the sidelines, and also a little bit from the future because people looked at this particular environment and said, wow, interest rates are very low, my savings are getting better, this might be the best time for me to enter the market. So we're kind of, in this particular period of time, seeing a little bit of the legacy demand, a little bit of the future demand, and it's all coming into one market, which manifests into this, what looks like hypergrowth. But the important thing to always keep in mind, and this is something that I say to investors, it's something I say to regulators and others when I'm asked, is just looking at the overall dynamic and that relationship between supply and demand. And it's only recently that people have started to really focus on the supply side. It's something that I, for one, have been saying for a decade plus, that we're simply not able to manufacture enough units.
Enough homes.
And there's different reasons for that. It's not all just the regulatory environment and sort of how approvals work. It's construction industry capacity. There's a number of constraints that just don't allow us to build as many homes as we need to match the growth in this area. But that was brought to light, I think, particularly in this particular market. And as a result of that, finally, people started paying attention because these demand side levers have been tried in the past, and we just kept seeing unrelenting growth. And then finally people said...
And I think we can relate to 2017's, the Wynne government implemented the Ontario Fair Housing Plan.
Yeah.
And that Band-Aid was literally ripped off within a 6-month period.
Yeah, it was quick. I mean, like at the end of the day, I don't believe that the demand side levers are particularly effective unless you address the supply side concerns. And if you don't address the supply side concern, like you said, it's only a Band-Aid. It's going to be a temporary solution as markets adjust. Because anytime you sort of are hitting the demand side, what you're doing is you're disadvantaging some consumer in some way, or some would-be consumer in some way. There's an adjustment period, and then typically, things kind of revert back to where they were. Only when you start addressing the other side of the coin can you make some progress.
It's estimated that 70% of the land zone for housing in Toronto is restricted to single, detached, or semi-detached homes.
Yeah.
How is that possible? And why isn't this making the headlines?
That's a great question. And it's something that the task force focused on. So one of their conclusions or recommendations was to sort of increase what they'll call laneway housing, or just the ability to sort of intensify not just big high-rise buildings and new developments.
The exclusionary zoning.
Right. And the answer to why, if you think about how sort of our planning environment works here municipally, a lot of the bylaws, the actual zoning bylaws that are required to go ahead and get a building permit to build something, many of those have been written in a past era, right? So the zoning bylaws exist from sometimes the 1950s, the 1960s, 70s, when the requirements for housing in the city were much different than they are today. So
the workforce and composition of the city was one that wouldn't even be recognized today.
Right, and the number of people and sort of our overall economic output, and there's many different factors. But if you think just at a very simple level, the city since then has evolved into something, as you just put, would be unrecognizable. Nobody could have sat there in 1960 and said, I predict Toronto will be 6.5 million people and this prosperous XXX. But some of those bylaws were written back then. And why it looks as, back then, 70% of the land probably was pretty adequate for low density housing.
Sure.
Because that was the city's needs at the time. So what hasn't kept up with the times is our planning framework. And that's something that, needs to be addressed, and it's addressed deal by deal, so to speak. Like every time we build something, we have to go ahead and amend the zoning bylaw because, again, it was probably written sometime in the 60s. So the city has been tackling that sort of overhaul of their planning landscape site by site, as opposed to one giant comprehensive overhaul, which just, to their defense, isn't very efficient to do. But sometimes things like this that bypass that requirement are important because it allows us to densify quicker.
From what I hear from you, Sasha, and again, the specific audience that we're speaking to today and the community that I personally want to see us build, and we're going to build it together because I want you to be back here all the time, is one where the audience can actually take some practical and tactical advice out of what we speak of. You're at the top of Greybrook Securities. You guys raise hundreds of millions of dollars. You buy hundreds, thousands of acres. You have different funds that buy multifamily apartments. Anybody who has any question as to where this insight comes from or what Mr. Choo Choo's does, please feel free to use the old Google. Google his name, Google the company. You'll find out so much as to why he's here. Where is Greybrook seeing the future? I want to talk about where are you buying? Where do you lead those massive investors, those hundreds and thousands of investors into battle every day? What are you looking at? What's on your radar?
Yeah, it's funny. I get asked that question a lot, and I give an answer that sometimes surprises people. The answer is everything. We will buy everything, and we are very bullish on Toronto as we have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's been the same. Our investment thesis has been the same. And sometimes people are surprised because they look at what's happening in the world today, right? That sort of, but interest rates are going up and inflation and, this, that, and the other. And we don't ignore that, but we always, as a real estate investor, you're a long-term investor. This is not a business that you're in. This is not an investment that you make if you're just looking to make a trade, so to speak. It's not a stock. So at the end of the day, when you have fundamentals like we have here in Southern Ontario and that supply-demand imbalance and just a true need for housing, then really we're interested in buying the whole market of varying types. So let me put it to you this way. All type of housing is required for our growth, right? Given the amount of immigration, given the amount of migration, condo units aren't going to cut it. Single family homes aren't going to cut it. Townhomes aren't going to cut it in and of themselves. It's all of those are a requirement. So it's about buying sort of all different types of housing in order to be able to fulfill that demand going forward. And whenever I'm asked, you mentioned bubble, and I get asked that question all the time. The answer is as follows. A bubble, a true bubble, is when there's an absence of fundamentals. It's when capital can just leave because, I don't like it here anymore, I'm out. And then nothing is left to pick up the pieces. In this market, we have a lot left to pick up the pieces. It's that fundamental demand that's driving it and a true lack of supply. So it's not to say that there can't be volatility at periods of time, but that volatility will almost always be short term because of how strong the underlying basis is. So for us at Greybrook, we're extremely focused on trying to buy all different segments of the market when it comes to residential, housing that is for families, just as much as housing is for the rental customer in the downtown core. And we're very excited about continuing to do that this year, next year, and the year after, just like the 15 years prior, because we believe in it and we believe in the market's fundamentals.
Sasha, I thank you for your insight. We are running out of time. I want you to leave the Investor Playbook community with your top tip. If I am an investor today looking to make my first investment, is this market one that over the next 5 years will gain ground? What is your advice, your insight?
Yeah, absolutely. My single piece of advice is to not fall prey to the noise. There's always a lot of noise. Just like now there's noise, there was noise in 2009, there was noise in 2004. I've seen it through market cycles, and the advice that I would give is that you have to kind of just ignore the headlines and focus on, I'm a long-term investor, and this market has very strong fundamentals. And if you give yourself that 5-year time frame, like you said, you'll be fine.
Sasha Choo-Choos, thank you for joining Investor Playbook. InvestorsPlaybook.com. You can find this interview amongst with a ton of other resources. We'll see you in just a few minutes with the Developments Corner. Thank you. Welcome to Investor Playbook. Investor Playbook is the show for the real estate investor, the real estate end user, the real estate enthusiast. Investor Playbook is a one single resource where you can literally go to investorsplaybook.com and find everything you need on making the right decision for you. No investment is the same for everyone. Everybody's situation is different. And this show is brought to you by REC Canada, the nation's leading investment-focused real estate group. My name is Simeon Papailias. I'm the co-founder of REC Canada. And today I'm being joined by Mr. Hunter Milbourne of Milbourne Group, a gentleman who represents a cool 20% of new housing coming online in the city of Toronto. Hunter, welcome to Investors Playbook. It is our pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Simeon.
Hunter, the world is screaming, kicking, and crying affordability, affordability, affordability. So much so that by the end of last year in December, the province put together a task force with a mandate of 60 days. A problem that's taken 30 years to put together. They gave the task force 60 days, 2 months, December to the end of January, to put together a report on the fundamentals of the affordability issues in Ontario. The good news is that this task force and one of the members is a very good friend of InvestorsPlaybook.com, is a personal friend of mine and of our company, and he's a titan for the industry, none other than the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association, Mr. Tim Hudak, who has joined us on many shows before. Tim was part of this task force, and their findings are in line with everything that as industry insiders for me and you, we know. I don't think it's difficult for us to speak to what the issue in Ontario is, because it is supply. Our supply is constrained to levels never predicated before.
Well, kudos to the province for getting that done and getting it done so quickly. And, after reading it a few days ago, I think that, I was quite impressed because not only was it fairly succinct and accurate in terms of the problems, but it really gave several concrete, implementable recommendations that I think that they will definitely act on.
For sure. So like for me to just a few of the key points to hit, and this is something we knew because Scotiabank put out a report, RBC put out a report a year prior to this study. But as of right now, Ontario must build 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years to address the current supply demands. How does the province hope to see a goal that bold come to life? What needs to happen, Hunter?
Well, I think it really starts with the municipalities. I mean, I think that the capital is there in the private sector, the motivation is there in the private sector with developers to purchase land and get it approved and get it built. Getting it sold is not a problem right now. But I guess the key words in that little phrase there are getting it approved because, we've all heard long horror stories about a developer buys a piece of land that he thinks might get approved in 12 or 18 months, and then 4 years later, 5 years later, 7 years later, for various reasons, it's still going through an approval process.
We see in the news all the time, in Toronto especially, somebody wants to buy an existing property, they want to build a fourplex. So there is people, investors, private money looking at buying a 1950s bungalow sitting on a 60-foot lot 400 meters from the subway, and they want to put together a fourplex, a sixplex, a duplex. They want to increase the density. But you have every neighbor in the street.
I was going to say, what are the neighbors going to say and think, right?
Every neighbor on the street, not in my backyard. The NIMBYism in Toronto is heavy. Yeah. The task force put together one of the major proposals, one of the biggest points in this, is to nip that in the butt once and for all by taking away the exclusionary zoning that's currently in place and has been. I believe something like 70% of land zoned for housing in Toronto is restricted to single detach. As if that is a metropolitan world-class city of today. That is not.
No, it's a bit of a history lesson. Really.
It is a bit of a history. I think that's a great point. So if we were to streamline the development process where somebody doesn't have to go through a 2-year process, we're going to have a lot more people looking to actually do this and increase the density from an organic, real point where if I own a property by the subway, forget about selling it, I can develop my own property and increase it to 6 doors for the said lot.
Well, the other cool thing that I, read about thought about when I read that piece was it really democratizes a little bit the development industry because it allows, a single family homeowner to either do something themselves or partner with somebody and create some extra housing and affordability and not leaving it all to large developers.
And of course, creating wealth while he's doing it.
100%.
So I think this is what people need to understand. Real estate is one of those unique asset classes that you can leverage both the financial industry, meaning you can get a mortgage with 20% down. When you can leverage 5x your own money and you have a property by the subway, and there's a reason now that you don't have to go through a 2-year song and dance to do something, I think we can increase the city's supply of housing, literally double it, if the infrastructure and the rules were favorable to do so. You would have everybody in the city looking at their asset as something they can grow wealthy with, as well as help keep affordability in place. Meaning that the single detached home is $6,000 a month versus having 4 units at $1,500 a month, where everybody can live and enjoy the city, enjoy the infrastructure while living in a humane, affordable city. I think that's some of the biggest problems. Hunter, 65% of purpose-built rentals in the city of Toronto were built between 1960 and 1980. What incentives do you feel the city or the government, both federal, provincially, municipally, need to give to see an increase in the purpose-built rental space?
Well, because rents have increased, you're seeing a lot more purpose-built rentals, both in the low end, medium end, and high end, but maybe not enough in the low end. But they could give property tax holidays. They could eliminate or reduce development charges. I mean, I think a lot of consumers don't realize, for example, in the city of Toronto, just how much if someone buys a $600,000 or $700,000 condo, there's probably 10 to 14% of that goes back to the city in fees.
And that's the zoning component?
Well, it's Section 37, it's development charges, it's money that the developer doesn't get, and it's money that the developer typically paid for infrastructure. Build the schools, build the fire stations, build the roads. It was always infrastructure. But in a mature city like Toronto, why does the city need so much development charges? And those increased significantly in the last 3 or 4 years.
The city right now, the city council overwhelmingly voted for a home flipping tax, a speculation and home flipping tax. They did not give out any details as of this moment, but they're looking at bringing this to the Premier of Ontario to be enforced. Do you believe that there is such a significant amount of speculation and flipping that's driving up home prices? What do you believe is the actual root cause of this journey that we've seen prices go up 15 and 20% per year over the last 3 years?
Listen, I think it's fundamentally a supply issue. If that reselling or flipping, as people call it, I mean, in our experience, let's say, our firm has been selling condominiums in the GTA for over 45 years, and we have a pretty significant market share, about 18 to 20% annually of all the sales of pre-construction condos, which makes our volume around 5,000 to 7,000 units a year, because typically in the GTA, there might be 30 to 35,000 sales annually of pre-construction condos, not counting resales.
That's not doors delivered, that's doors that will be delivered.
Right, sales.
Got it.
So now if you fast forward, during that period of time, we have a separate division and a separate group that does handle rentals and resales of those projects or of those homes, right? And this is not someone buying or reselling an existing condominium. It would be a pre-construction home only. But on average, what we'd say, let's say out of every 1,000 units that we've sold and get delivered, let's say 3, 4, 5 years later, about 50 to 60% of them are people that move in. About 30 to 40% of them are people who rent. And maybe 10% plus or minus are people who would resell.
Within that first year.
Or or between contract and closing, which is over, let's say, a 4-year period.
The assignment. And that's really, really strong insight. And this is why having you on the show is invaluable. And for me to tone this, when you have data from somebody who sells 5,000 to 7,000 condos a year.
Pre-construction
condos a year, which means if you've been at this for 40 years, Hunter, you've seen enough cycles come and go. So the data that we see of the flipper being, let's call it 10%, the end user, the tenant, having that data is invaluable.
Well, yeah, and if the city wants to do it to make some extra revenue instead of increasing parking tickets or red light fines or whatever, then so be it. But the thing is, it's not going to cool the housing market down. What's going to cool the housing market down is everything in this provincial report that the Ford government came out with, and it's that how do you streamline the approval process to increase supply and fundamental economic supply and demand. If you can increase the supply by approximately double, because to do 150,000 new homes per year in the province is probably about double or a little more than double than what's happening right now.
Hunter, I want to thank you so much for your insight this morning. I appreciate it, and I do hope to have you back on the show soon. I also look forward to some of your insight. I do understand that your firm will be advising hopefully the Premier's office with some very good data on the subject, and hopefully we see some change that will affect getting supply back in control, getting to those homes delivered where affordability can be achieved in the city of Toronto, and of course in Canada in general, as we are testing markets across the country. Hunter, thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Investors Playbook and investorsplaybook.com. Guys, we're heading into the mortgage and finance segment of our show. Joining me today is my very own Director of Operations at the REC Canada Group. REC Canada is Canada's leading investment focus advisory group. And Bobby, specifically guides every one of our brokers. We have 50 brokers across the Golden Horseshoe serving investors. And he gives advice, leadership, and improves their efficiency and their skill sets every day. You also speak, Bobby, to investors. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Simeon. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to your insight on this very important topic, which is the mortgage and finance, as it pertains to investors. It is very different to advise, as we very well know, an end user who is looking to buy a home, live in it for 20 years. The advice is simple. Find the best mortgage rate, live your life.
Exactly.
To the investor, real estate is a business. It is a function. It is an asset to hold, to work with, to the terms of a mortgage, everything about a mortgage. How do you see the actual function of a mortgage to the investor?
Yeah, a mortgage is a tool in your tool belt. There's no other way to describe it in my mind as an investor first and foremost. That's exactly how I then advise to other investors. It is simply a tool that you're going to utilize in order to acquire and or hold real estate.
I don't think anybody listening right now doesn't know what a mortgage is. So I want to be ultra clear. I want to be extremely concise in what we're trying to frame right now. Mm-hmm. When you call it a tool in your toolbox, it's because if you're an investor, the reason you like real estate is because real estate you can leverage. You put 20% down, so your $100,000 can buy you $500,000 worth of real estate. As opposed to the stock market, $100,000 buys you $100,000 worth of stock.
Real estate is an immediate 5x. Here in Ontario, most of the way across Canada, it's an immediate 5x based on what you can put down in order to acquire.
With that being said, it's a tool in your tool belt. What are the crucial items an investor needs to know that are important? Is it the interest rate? Is it the term? Is it the amortization? Break down for me the importance of each component, or maybe the top 3 components of a mortgage, which is rate, term, amortization period.
So amortization period is actually where I start first and foremost, and that is that's the length at which they're going to amortize across, they being your lender. I always, as an investor, look to make my payments as small as possible. There, it would be the amortization as long as possible, 30-year amortizations, in some cases with commercial.
And that is to increase your cash flow.
To increase cash flow. That's the absolute mechanism.
So as you carry any said property,
yes,
you're going to have as little of payment as possible.
I describe this as a balloon in a vise. If you tighten that vise, the balloon expands. That expansion is simply a bigger payment. If you open the vise and the balloon sticks and it spreads itself way out farther, right, it shrinks as your payment would. It's a balloon in a vise. The longer you go with an AM.
I love the context of that, Bobby. Tell me a little bit about the term. Why would somebody choose a 2-year term over a 5-year term? Does it have to do with volatility? Is it personal choice? What are the benefits? Does it vary?
It can be a little bit of the things that you said, personal choice, volatility, perhaps. But mostly, an investor would use that as a tool based on what they are doing with the real estate that they have then acquired.
What would you do in a market like today where we know that this month interest rates are set to go up by a quarter basis point? We know that in August, we know that in October, we're probably going to see the same. So let's anticipate 75 beeps, as we call it in the industry, or 0.75% in the interest rates to go up over the next year.
Yeah.
So with that being said, would you look at locking in your financing on any said property, or is there still enough room to hedge against it by keeping your variable? You'd be still ahead of the game?
There is a broader question, however, though. So everybody asks the same questions the same way that you just did. But the actual question is, what type of property or what type of investment have I made, right? So that I can then utilize the best form of mortgage in order to accomplish the best possible thing for that investment. So when I'm selecting term, it is almost strictly based upon what I anticipate doing. If I buy to renovate, to refinance, I want a shorter term. I want less breakage. I want that to come up at the same time I need
When
to
you
come
say
out.
less breakage, you mean that once you're refinancing, et cetera, not to have penalties.
Exactly.
So you're going to do a 1-year term during the renovation. At that point, you refinance, for example, for 5 years as you're going into a tenancy, a long-term tenancy agreement with the market.
That's exactly right. So the term, the functionaries of the mortgage itself, they always change based upon the investment that you're making. And this is exactly where I would then turn to any one investor and say, your 75 beeps, that increase of what can't amount to much more than $500 total across many common mortgages.
On the average mortgage.
Exactly, on the average mortgage, that $500 is irrelevant, okay, depending upon what you're doing, okay, or it's completely relevant when it comes to your P&L, your profit loss, your cash flow statements. So you're concerned about rate in only so much as like what it's going to cost you in order to then carry any one property to the best of its ability.
Well, I think there's a mass confusion between the average Canadian who's living in a home that his carrying costs are about to increase, and every person that's living those thoughts in this, I am going to call it a volatile market, because when you see double-digit appreciation in home prices every year for the last 3 years, rates have been historically record lows, and they're about to go up. I think people who have bought in the last few years are now getting leery and nervous because am I still going to be able to afford my home?
And that right there lends itself to a mistake that novice investors commonly make. They use historically low data
To
build a pro forma or a cash flow analysis or a P&L statement, right? And then the moment that anything in that statement changes for the worse, in this case, the worst being a 25 basis point or $200 increase on that particular mortgage on a monthly basis, if that's your worst case scenario and it puts you in a bind, you've run your numbers incorrectly.
And you weren't conservative enough, nor did you go thick or deep enough in your due diligence.
You've nailed it right
Now,
there.
We are running out of time. The shows only have so many minutes, my man. Give me your top tip on what an investor should be looking at this right now. If somebody's looking to get an investment property, what should they be doing right now?
To me, it is always systems and numbers based. Always. Get your numbers right. Do your analysis. You never jump into anything with historical lows, historical highs. There's always a median or a mode or a mean to this entire thing. The differences become obvious when you start to work more and more in the numbers. Okay? But you're running your numbers, get them right. And if you need help with that, that is literally what Investors Playbook is here to do.
For anybody looking for a cash flow analyzer for this pro forma that we speak to, please head over to our website at www.investorsplaybook.com. You're going to find great tools, great templates that you can start basing your research on before you make any mistakes, and hopefully you can leverage some of the mistakes of others before making them yourself. Bobby, thank you for being on the show. Appreciate it. Welcome back to the fourth and final segment. To all my investors, my brothers and sisters in the business, I want to welcome you back for this very important Q&A. It's actually my favorite segment, where we get to analyze the most asked questions of any time. And in this case, it's an overwhelming and easy path to take. Everybody is looking for some advice on how to get started. Bobby, we're going to continue on with the number one question. If I'm looking to start my investment and real estate journey, what is a great place to start? What is the mindset, perhaps? What is it we need to think of when we're embarking on this journey?
From a mindset perspective, it's a personal opinion here, but I believe that every new investor needs to understand how and when to sacrifice some of their own wants in order to then push their agenda forward. The example would be, I believe that house hacking is probably the best possible strategy for any one new investor getting in, especially for their first one.
What is house hacking?
House hacking means that you're going to make the sacrifice to live in one room and rent all of the others, whether it's friends, coworkers, perhaps people you don't know, but purchasing something with as little of your own money down as possible, utilizing a primary residence exemption mechanisms to do so, and then utilizing what the other rooms in the home can do. So it doesn't feel great, right? You may want to live on your own. You may want your first purchase to be your best purchase ever. But the advice given from the investment side would be, that's not now. That's a decade from now when this property is appreciated and cash flowed for you that entire time.
I think that's a great piece of advice, and I think so for the following reasons. The question was, how do I begin my investment journey? And I think that is an excellent answer. Meaning, if you have $50,000 to $100,000, because we do live, in this case, we're in Toronto, Ontario, that's not going to get you very far. If you do leverage the mechanisms that you're talking about as a first-time home buyer, so don't only think of investment as a second property.
Right.
Anything can be an investment. And this question is exciting because if you're looking to begin investing in real estate, you can literally leverage your first-time home buyer credit. You only get one.
Yeah.
You're only a first-time home buyer once. And that's the time that you can get a mortgage with 5% down, 10% down, 15, depending on your qualifications, depending if you have a cosigner, depending on a myriad of things that you can find on the mortgage section of investorsplaybook.com, where there's all the FAQs, the strategies used, interviews, and so much more. However, I want to stick to this strategy. So let's say you're starting out and you have a budget of, let's call it $600,000. You're working, you have some savings, you pick up that first condominium, that first townhouse. What prevents you from renting out a couple of the bedrooms, the other bedroom, your parking spot?
Yeah.
Everything can be monetized in a city where housing is at a premium. Housing is in very, very short supply. You can get rent of $1,000, $1,200 for a room.
But to answer your question, the only thing stopping you from that is your mindset about what that is.
I love that.
That's it.
Bobby, how much money do I need to start investing? So this is a great segue.
I love this question too. And the reason I love this question is because it's unanswerable. It truly is. The answer to the question is 5% minimum, perhaps 10%, perhaps 15%. It depends on what you're going to need to do. The real answer to the question is, it's another lifestyle sacrifice. Drive until you qualify. Understand what those.
What does that mean?
That means if I can't afford to buy $4 million homes in the core of Toronto, then I'm going to drive to Cambridge, Ontario, where I grew up, right? In order to better find affordability for myself. That's what that means. So all of that being said, it's 5% of whatever you believe you can afford.
That's for the first-time home buyer.
And any primary residence. Let's not mistake the two. Okay, so especially in this case. However, if you are an investor looking to add second, third, and fourth properties to your mix, you're going to require 20%.
Sure.
But when do you require that 20%? And this is where it becomes truly unanswerable. If you're investing in pre-construction with experts in this particular field, you could put as little as 5% down this year, save your ass off, and go to the next one.
5% off next year?
Exactly. If you want to go into resale, however, you're going to need to go to 20%.
But you're also going to have the immediate income. So I think what we're really honing in on is every investor has different goals.
Yes.
To the guy starting out, to the gal looking to get into her first condo, into her first property, I think it's very easy to understand the fundamentals once you study it. So my advice right now, because these questions are so relatable to one another, if you're looking to start in getting into real estate, it's still an investment as far as I'm concerned if you're living in it and you're investing into the future of your journey. So you can buy it with as little as 5%, all the way up to 20% if it's your second, third, or fourth property.
Yes, sir.
Depending on your goals and your ability to close on mortgages, pre-construction, meaning you're buying off the floor plan, meaning you're literally looking at your screen, you're picking something that's going to be built and actualize in 4 years, where it gives you time to prepare, to save more, etc. And if you are looking for something immediate that you can live in right now, rent out the basement, rent out a room, what have you, you'd be looking at an income property / house hacking.
Yes, sir.
Bobby, I'm going to ask you one last question for today because we are running out of time. It's the second most asked questions for a decade. How do I know I'm succeeding as an investor in real estate? If I don't sell and I hold the real estate, how am I winning? What are the different gauges we use for real estate? How does one win?
Such a great question. I think that there are 4, 5, maybe even 6 ways to win in real estate. I would define them very specifically as market appreciation. That would be owning in the market. So instead of paying somebody else's rent, you're paying towards the appreciating value of something that works in a marketplace with fundamentals as strong as Southwestern Ontario.
Great.
Right? So there's that. There's cash flow. That's the ability to pay yourself $1 above and beyond any of the costs that you have.
So if I own a condo, for example, it costs me $1,200 or $1,500 a month all in, and I'm getting $1,600 a month in rent. I'm making $100 a month, and then my mortgage is also getting reduced.
Yes. So if you could take that $100 and go to the movies, buy ice cream, do whatever you will do with that $100, and it has no negative effect on what the actual investment is, you're winning. You've touched on the next one, and we touched on in the previous segment of the show, would be mortgage paydown. That's somebody else paying your mortgage for you.
God bless them.
Thank you very much. There are also tax advantages to ownership,
Of course.
which would be my 4th or 5th. Okay. There's also then the ability to capitally expend inwardly, okay, into the property, which then, in theory, can create another version of a tax break for you.
Meaning you're spending money into the property that is written off,
Exactly.
and then the value of the property is also going up as you're improving it.
And therein lies the one thing that an investor can truly take into their hands, right? And I would call it capital improvements, right? Or forced appreciation.
I love that.
Right? That's how I've made a lot of my bones in real estate, actively adding to what the property is. Buying something with 1 unit only, adding a second. Buying a duplex, adding a 3rd unit in some way. Right? Doing those things are going to help to push that value upwardly. If you're doing any one of those 5 things, you're winning. If you're doing more than one of those things, you are a savvy enough investor to understand what we are talking about.
Bobby, I want to thank you for your time. That's about all the time we have for today's Q&A. For our audience, for these questions, for a myriad of other questions, simply visit our investorsplaybook.com website, join the community, and you'll be able to ask questions, have both investors and us answer them, and feature them onto the next show. Until next Saturday, we'll see you soon.